Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. No guest today. It is just me and whoever happens to pop into the chat and ask questions to keep me going. I do have the basic outline of a show. I want to start with something you may have heard before or seen online. Out of context, the same way you probably got it the first time you heard it, because it's so good, it's worth quoting by itself just to start. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Now, that's pretty clearly a call to action. And that was spending a lot of time on the internet from 2020 to 2022 before people making noise on the internet got sucked into other sorts of fights. And that comes from a poem by a man named Percy Shelley called The Masque of Anarchy, which was written in 1819 in England after the events of a rather terrible act of government violence against the people called the Peterloo Massacre. Before I recite the whole poem, which I'm going to do, I warn you in advance, I want to talk about what the Peterloo Massacre was and sort of set the stage for what the poem is about. This was August of 1819, and there was a large public meeting in the public square of Manchester, England. And they ordered in a place called St. Peter's Field. They organized a mass rally in August 1819. It was supposed to go on for as long as it took. And they were protesting for universal manhood suffrage. This was a big deal in England in 1819 because only people who owned property or who had specific rights to vote through a town charter or a university charter actually got to vote. The average working person in Manchester or London or Leeds didn't get to vote. They didn't own property. They were just a renting worker. Who cares? Now, that sounds pretty backward to us. Even universal manhood suffrage, every male over the minimum age gets to vote, sounds a little backward to us these days when we think about, well, women didn't even vote back then. Even after universal manhood suffrage passed, they had to have a whole movement for women to be able to vote. So it still sounds backward. At the same time, you have to look at what else was going on in 1819, and just asking to vote was actually maybe too easy of an ask. This was 4 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Waterloo had been in 1815. England had been at peace for 4 years, should have been on a peacetime economy, should have been, in the post-war boom, and things should have been good. At least if you go by the history of, say, the U.S. after World War II and the way modern economists analyze things. But that wasn't what was happening in England in 1819. England in 1819 had a very reactionary government. The prime minister was tremendously unpopular, despite being prime minister, because they weren't even really elected. The prime minister was just basically appointed by the king. He didn't even always have a majority in parliament, though he needed a majority in parliament if he wanted to successfully legislate. That's a whole another argument. But the prime minister was a man named Spencer Perceval, Earl of Liverpool before he died, left over from the Napoleonic Wars, too conservative for the times. He is the only British prime minister to ever have been assassinated, and perhaps you'll see why in a moment. But so they were having a mass rally for universal suffrage on St. Peter's lawn when the Peterloo Massacre happened. Now, the movement for universal manhood suffrage had been going on for a few years in 1819. They had been trying to get everyone the vote. There was what was called the working class radical movement, which was at odds with the liberal radical movement, which was backed by capitalists, who wanted more participation in government by basic citizens, a repeal of the reactionary corn laws, which were passed in theory to protect farmers, but actually ended up stabilizing prices for the people selling bread, and ended up costing the people buying bread too much money. And so there was a demand for repeal of the corn laws. Everyone wanted the right to vote. It was extremely Spencer Percival, Earl of Liverpool. Sounds like it'd be the title of a Beatles song from Sgt. Pepper. Yeah, it kind of does. And he's not even in the poem, but it does. Some of the people in the poem come off like cartoon characters too. So on the first day of the rally, even before any real protesting started, the Manchester city government, in the form of their local magistrates, called on the local militia, which was called the yeomanry, and which had allegedly been formed to protect England from a possible French invasion during the Napoleonic Wars, but would now be used against the British people, was sent to arrest a speaker named Henry Hunt and to shut down the rally. So the yeomanry went in to make their arrest. There was a failure to arrest him after several efforts. The yeomanry ended up charging into the crowd. They knocked down and injured a woman and killed a child. And keep in mind, the massacre hasn't started yet. But they did succeed in apprehending and arresting Hunt and pulling him away, at which point the crowd began screaming for them to let him go and moving forward as if trying to rescue him. At which point, some doofus ordered a cavalry regiment, which had been called up to back up the local militia just in case, to charge into the crowd. That's right. An unarmed crowd was charged by a cavalry regiment. Anywhere from 9 to 17 people were killed. Anywhere to 400 to 700 people were injured. The reason it was called the Peterloo Massacre is they were comparing it to the Battle of Waterloo. Very deliberately. It was on St. Peter's lawn, and a lot of people died. So they just had to compare the cavalry that charged their own people with the heroes of the war. It was in this context, the British military being unleashed against the British people and killing innocent civilians protesting for the right to vote because they didn't like that a speaker was being arrested for speaking on their behalf, that sets the stage for the poem. Percy Shelley was a young nobleman whose politics were nevertheless pretty anti-establishment for his day. His wife is more famous than he was. His wife was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein and the daughter of the British feminist leader Mary Wollstonecraft. So Shelley was a kind of a left-winger who was married to the daughter of a famous left-winger and who was criticizing the government because he thought it had gone too far. The language is very romantic and flowery. for which I apologize in advance, but all the same, I do think it adds to the musicality of the poem. I apologize for my recitation in advance, and I apologize for breaks to wet my throat in advance, but I'm going to recite the whole thing, so bear with me. As I lay asleep in Italy, there came a voice from o'er the sea, and with great power it forth led me to walk in the visions of poesy. I met murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they might be an admirable plight, for 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 he tossed the human hearts to chew, which from his wide cloak he drew. Next came Fraud, and he had on, like Eldon, an ermine gown, and his big tears, for he wept well, turned to millstones as they fell. And the little children who round his feet played to and fro, thinking every tear a gem, had their brains knocked out by them. Clothed with the Bible as with light, and the shadows of the night, like Sidmouth next hypocrisy on a crocodile rode by. And many more destructions played in this ghastly masquerade, all disguised, even to the eyes, like bishops, lawyers, peers, or spies. Last came Anarchy. He rode on a white horse, splashed with blood. He was pale, even to the lips, like death in the apocalypse. And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a scepter shone. And on his brow this mark I saw, I am God and King and Law. With a pace stately and fast over English land he passed, trampling to a mire of blood the adoring multitude. And a mighty troop around with their trampling shook the ground, waving each a bloody sword for the service of their Lord. And with glorious triumph they rode through England proud and gay, drunk as with intoxication on the wine of desolation. O'er fields and towns from sea to sea passed the pageant, swift and free, tearing up and trampling down till they came to London town. And each dweller panic-stricken felt his heart with terror sicken, hearing the tempestuous cry of the triumph of anarchy. For with pomp to meet him came, clothed in arms like blood and flame, the hired murderers who did sing, Thou art God and Law and King. We have waited, weak and lone, for thy coming, mighty one. Our purses are empty, our swords are cold. Give us glory and blood and gold. Lawyers and priests, a motley crowd, to the earth their pale brows bowed, like a bad prayer not over loud, whispering, Thou art Law and God. Then all cried with one accord, Thou art King and God and Lord. Anarchy, to thee we bow, be thy name made holy now. And Anarchy the skeleton bowed and grinned to everyone, as well as if his education had cost 10 millions to the nation. For he knew the palaces of our kings were rightly his scepter, crown, and globe, and the gold inwoven robe. So he sent his slaves before to seize upon the bank and tower, and was proceeding with intent to meet his pensioned parliament. When one fled past, a maniac maid, and her name was Hope, she said, but she looked more like despair, and she cried out in the air, My father time is weak and gray, with waiting for a better day. See how idiot-like he stands, fumbling with his palsied hands. He has had child after child, and the dust of death is piled over everyone but me. Misery, oh misery. Then she lay down in the street, right before the horse's feet, expecting with a patient eye murder, fraud, and anarchy. When between her and her foes a mist, a light, an image rose, small at first and weak and frail, like the vapor of a veil, till as clouds grow on the blast, like tower-crowned giants striding fast, and glare with lightnings as they fly, and speak in thunder to the sky. It grew, a shape arrayed in mail, brighter than the viper's scale, and upborne on wings whose grain was as the light of sunny rain. On its helm seen far away, a planet like the morning's lay, and those plumes its light rained through, like a shower of crimson dew, with step as soft as wind it passed, o'er the heads of men so fast, they knew the presence there, and looked, but all was empty air. As flowers beneath May's footstep waken, as stars from night's loose hair are shaken, as waves arise when loud winds call, thoughts sprung where'er that step did fall, and the prostrate multitude looked, and ankle deep in blood, hope, that maiden most serene, was walking with a quiet mien, and anarchy, the ghastly birth, laid dead earth upon the earth. The horse of death, tameless as wind, fled, and with his hoofs did grind to dust the murderers thronged behind. A rushing light of clouds and splendor, a sense awakening and yet tender, was heard and felt, and at its close these words of joy and fear arose, as if their own indignant earth, which gave the sons of England birth, had felt their blood upon her bow, and shuddering with a mother's throe, had turned every drop of blood by which her face had been bedewed to an accent unwithstood, as if her heart had cried aloud. Men of England, heirs of glory, heroes of unwritten story, nurslings of one mighty mother, hopes of her and one another, rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. And now you see that last verse as a call on the people to overthrow the state, which is exactly what Shelley was saying at the time, and is something that we should always keep in mind, that this is a call to revolution against a government being compared to anarchy because it is lawless. And yes, Connor is correct. Mary Shelley's father was William Goodwin, who is often considered the father of English anarchism. Goodwin and Wollstonecraft had very interesting debates. Goodwin published much of Wollstonecraft's work. He was supporting the feminist terrorist movement that was at work in England near the end of his life. But this is definitely worth mentioning. Thank you, Connor. So the poem now, in context, let's go on a couple of few specific notes. Obviously, they're talking about the massacre when they talk about blood. When they call out names early on in the poem, Castlereagh was the Secretary of State and leader of the House of Commons at the time. His official job was Secretary of Foreign Affairs, but he was the one really running the government while Spencer Perceval was making speeches in Parliament. And it was Castlereagh who was seen as the leading disciple of the former Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, and who was also seen as the guy who made the decision to put the cavalry regiment there. Spencer Perceval was assassinated. He was the prime minister. He doesn't make it into the poem. That's why, because Castlereagh was considered more important than Perceval. And that's why Castlereagh is called out as murder by Shelley, because he's blaming him. When he has him throwing hearts to bloodhounds, he's talking about setting people up for the soldiers. Eldon was one of the bishops of the time, which is why the reference to the ermine gown and the fraud. He made a big sermon asking for mercy and forgiveness for the victims of the massacre, in which he affected to cry, which is why they're talking about his tears turning to millstones and banging out the heads of children, because nothing good came of them despite all of his noisy sympathy. And that's worth keeping in our modern context, because we see a lot of that from our politicians. They cry for us. They cry for the people of East Palestine. They cry for the people of Flint. They cry for the people of Gaza. But they don't do anything for any of those people. They don't do anything for the guy working a 12-hour shift and wanting to make sure he can get health care, wanting to make sure he can get paid for his time without getting hassled when he gets sick. And Sid Mouth, Sid Mouth was another politician of the day. I believe he was also a bishop. That's the reference to being closed with the Bible and to hypocrisy. More expressing sympathy for victims, but not doing anything for them. Anarchy was the king, George IV, who hadn't been king very long, and who was considered even worse than his father, George III, who had enough problems that 13 American colonies went to war to declare independence to get away from him, and who was often blamed for that. So we have a poem that's calling for revolution against the state, calling out politicians by name, blaming the king for the murder of British citizens. And you can ask why our figures, similar in status to Shelley, don't sound more like Shelley today. We don't have anti-establishment politicians with the working class's interest at heart, calling for the working class to rise up and overthrow the oligarchy. We have demagogues on the far right pandering to people's problems by offering them scapegoats and promising to punish those scapegoats. But none of those scapegoats are the landlord and the boss. None of those scapegoats are the cops who beat us and our friends up in 2020. None of those people are calling on opposition to the politicians who sent the National Guard out to reinforce those cops in 2020. In 2020, Joe Biden was elected because of protests against the police. And his actions upon coming into office were to support the police, talk the police up, speak against anti-police policing movements in politics, and to try to make heroes out of the police in reference to the events of January 6th, while forgetting the violence the police committed against us. I think it's worth thinking about that when we think about what Shelley is talking about in the Masque of Anarchy and the way he's calling out politicians in his own day. I think it's worth calling attention to the fact that even the protest itself for universal manhood suffrage was not an attempt to overthrow the monarchy of the state. They were just asking for the people who were killed were just asking for the right to vote. The people who killed were just saying, hey, let me have advice and consent on whether or not the government sends troops to attack me. And that's what they were attacked for, not for actively attempting to overthrow the king, not for disloyalty to Parliament, not even for trying to take the land back from the nobles. No, they were attacked for protesting for the right to vote. You could argue that they weren't demanding enough, but they were demanding too much for the ruling class. And it was the same with the anti-cop protesters who elected Biden. They were asking for the police to be defunded, not abolished. They were asking for people to be let out of jail, but not for jails and prisons to be abolished. But they were attacked and beaten and arrested, and people were killed. And that's worth thinking about. You know, and this is worth talking about too, because, you know, if all you're asking about for is the right to vote, and I'll read this first, a government that doesn't grant its angry people the right to vote is stupid, because that government could always rig that vote and use it to trick the people into thinking they've been heard, which is something that was ongoing at the time. One of the reasons for parliamentary electoral reform was the problem of rotten boroughs, where a university constituency that only had maybe 20 permanent residents because it only actually represented the professors at the university would have 10 representatives in parliament, despite there only being 20 people voting. Whereas an urban borough with 10,000 people might only have one representative. And since representatives all had individual votes in parliament, those rotten boroughs with more representation than more populated boroughs had a huge advantage even after universal manhood suffrage. Before universal manhood suffrage, the people who controlled the rotten boroughs controlled parliament and controlled legislation. That's why you didn't need to be the majority to be prime minister. You just needed the king's support and control of the right political bosses. Then you had a parliamentary majority on individual votes to get things done. But all that said, they chose, rather than give people the right to vote, well, let's arrest them and kill them. That's the direction that our politics is going today. If you want to look at some of the historical similarities, we should be enjoying a peace dividend. Biden came into office, pulled us out of Afghanistan. Trump had allegedly pulled us out of Syria, though that wasn't really the case. We had scaled back in Iraq, though we haven't really pulled out the way we were supposed to. We should be enjoying a peace dividend, and instead, our rich get richer while working people suffer under a stagnant, inflationary economy where our money doesn't buy enough. This is worth mentioning too, because as more and more working class Americans continue not to vote and oligarchs more openly control the government, the illusion of democracy through electorism is shattering here and in Europe. That's not inaccurate either. 25 million people who voted in 2020 did not vote in 2024. 5 million fewer people voted for Trump when he won in 2024 than when he lost in 2020. The reason that he won is because 15 million people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 didn't vote in 2024. They stayed home too. That's 20 million voters who didn't vote at all because of the choices. 5 million people were not willing to vote for Trump again. And 15 million people were not willing to vote for Kamala Harris to stop Trump because she did such a poor job of selling herself that no one thought she took the threat of Trump seriously. If Kamala Harris doesn't take the threat of Trump seriously, why should anyone else? Now that comes into a whole nother topic, and that's a show on its own. And I think I've already done that show at least twice, so I won't get into that topic too much again. But it's worth saying that if the Democratic Party really was fighting against fascism in the 2024 election, they would have more of a plan to keep fighting fascism after losing that election instead of submitting to it and promising to be bipartisan with it. And as I said on Twitter a couple of days ago, when Nancy Pelosi said, I want a strong Republican Party. Well, you know, she got a strong Republican Party. This is what she wanted. This is what she wanted. This is why nobody tried to win. And yet, why did they want this if they were fighting against fascism? Why would they want to have the chance to be collaborationist with a fascist president if they were fighting against fascism? And the answer becomes because they're not fighting against fascism, they're fighting to protect the same status quo that ultimately the fascists are trying to protect for the same oligarchs. This is why more billionaires donated to Kamala Harris's platform than Donald Trump's, even though Donald Trump's billionaires were much more high-profile people and doing much more openly brazen things, allegedly not associated with his campaign. Because they work for the same people, just one's the bad cop and one's the good cop. And, you know, the good cop is still a cop who's not on your side. And this is why we have to call out politicians the way Percy Shelley did, and why we have to not just settle for a more responsive political system or tinker around the edges reform. We need to take control of the system ourselves. And by we, I mean the international working class. That means working people here in America, the unemployed here in America, the homeless here in America, disabled and retired people here in America, both undocumented immigrants here in America and people suffering corporate oppression that often starts in America overseas, so that we can be relatively comfortable compared to them. All of this has to be taken into account. It's not enough to just say we need to be for the guy working a 12-hour shift. We absolutely do. And the guy working a 12-hour shift is somebody who is important and has to be listened to and can't be condescended to, which is something else that I'm seeing a lot, is condescension. One thing you don't see Percy Shelley do here is condescend to the English working class. He says, hey, there are more of you than us. You should kick our asses and take over. And I think it's worth saying you should kick our asses and take over because, you know, he's one of the ruling class. That's why he's saying ye are many, they are few. In his speaking, he's not completely identifying himself with the oppressed. He understands that he's less oppressed than the people he's writing about, but he still writes about it and he still speaks to them and not to power. He speaks about power to the people. He calls power out to the people. And he tells the people they should be running things and not the king. You should be running things and not the politicians, folks. You should be running things in town halls and workers' councils and community organizations. And this is something that we can do. They're scared of us doing it. If we were able to organize enough to completely divest from the system, not pay the landlord rent, not work for the boss, the landlord and the boss would be helpless. The problem is they deny us the resources to do that because they know that there are more of us than there are of them, and we have to find ways to take care of each other before we can take the next step of fighting back and while we fight back, which makes it harder for us. And they know it's harder for us. They know this is an asymmetrical system, which means we have to find ways to make it harder for them in that same asymmetrical way. And we need to talk to each other about them instead of begging them while talking about each other. Because when we beg for help from politicians, we are confirming their sense of strength. We need to call them out. We need to call them to account with each other, and we need to organize against them. Now, those are my final thoughts on the original topic. I do want to recommend more reading on Shelley. He's an interesting figure. He died before he was 30. His politics were imperfect. He falls into some of the traps of the ruling class. He believes a mass underclass movement will rise up spontaneously and save him. That brings him a little closer to some of the historical anarchists than to some of the historical Marxists who believe that the working class needs to be organized to save itself. But he did understand at the same time that the working class rising up to overthrow their oppressors would help him rather than hurt him, which is something not everybody born into the ruling class is able to understand, and which we have to give him credit for. And of course, with a father-in-law who helped found the British anarchism, it makes sense that he would be more anarchist than Marxist, especially since Marxism hadn't happened yet in 1819. But you can see some of the elements of proto-Marxism there too. He's very much concerned with advocating the truth for the working masses no matter what, and speaking truth about the people in power no matter what, and not hiding behind liberalism or just demanding the right to vote. And I think we need to find how we can express our demands in ways that we have to be listened to, which is why I return again to the subject of divestment. So if you've enjoyed this show, if you say, I like history, I like nerdy politics, I like seeing someone analyze history and literature in a nerdy political light, if you'd like me to be able to do more of the shows that I do with guests where we have conversations that get into the weeds, or if you like something solo topical like this, either way, what can you do to help support this show? Well, part of it's right here. I am on Patreon, Eclectic Radical. You can subscribe to support the show there. There are a few choices. You can also donate to us on the Cash App at Eclectic Radical. Or if you want to make a donation during PayPal, you can DM me on Twitter or Blue Sky at Eclectic Radical, and I can help you do that. I hope you've enjoyed the show today. My very last thought for the weekend is something I didn't talk about on the show, but I want to bring up now, which is the idea that I saw someone express that it's unfair to police the language of people who work 12 hours a day because they work 12 hours a day. And their oppression means that it's just not fair or nice to tell them not to use slurs like the N-word or the R-word because they work hard. Who cares if they use slurs? They work hard. They need to let off steam. First, the people most heavily committed to slurs aren't working 12-hour shifts. The people most heavily committed to slurs are the spoiled brat class, the would-be elites whose parents were of the upper middle class, who think they're just going to be even better than their parents, and the failed spawn of the oligarchs. These are the people who want to be able to use slurs, not working people. Working people want to make more money and work less hours and sleep more and have more time with their families and enjoy themselves more. We're not worried about our right to say the N-word or the R-word. And if that's really your biggest concern, then I'd say you're not oppressed enough to lead a revolution. And if you think that's my biggest concern as a working person, I'd say you don't understand workers enough to lead a revolution. And that's my final thought for the day. Thanks, folks. I will see everybody next week. I hope to have a guest and a conversation, but I do hope you enjoyed this show. I managed to go more than 40 minutes by myself. That's a record. I hope everybody has a great week. And until next Sunday, I'll tweet at you. Take care.